This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for listeners like you. One that you might like is Light in Gaza, Writings Born of Fire, edited by Jihad Abu Salim, Jennifer Bing, and Mike Merriman-Lotz. Gaza, home to 2 million people, continues to face suffocating conditions imposed by Israel. This distinctive anthology imagines what the future of Gaza could be, while reaffirming the critical role of Gaza in Palestinian identity, history, and struggle for liberation. Light in Gaza is a seminal, moving, and wide-ranging anthology of Palestinian writers and artists. As political discourse shifts towards futurism as a means of reimagining a better way of living, beyond the violence and limitations of colonialism, Light in Gaza is an urgent and powerful intervention into an important political moment. As Ali Abunimah puts it, this brilliant, funny, and inspiring collection of stories and essays by writers in Gaza was exactly what I needed to reinvigorate my hope and determination to work for a future that uplifts us all. Light in Gaza, out now from Haymarket Books, and available on haymarketbooks.org, where U.S. and U.K. readers receive free shipping on orders over $25 and £25, respectively. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Last week's episode was my interview with Gail Radford on her wonderful book, Modern Housing for America. We discussed Catherine Bauer and the Labor Housing Conference's New Deal-era efforts to make the U.S.'s new public housing system a social housing system that might appeal to and house the majority of Americans. But real estate reaction and rising conservatism defeated those efforts. The upshot was the two-tier housing system that came to define the American 20th century. An underfunded public housing system reserved for the very poorest and directly subsidized by the federal government, alongside a much, much larger system of private homeownership, indirectly and much less visibly but heavily subsidized by the federal government. That underfunded public housing system sometimes subjected tenants to awful conditions. It also reflected and reinforced the residential segregation that remade the suburbanized American metropolis. But by and large, the public housing that was constructed throughout the mid-20th century has also given poor people, particularly poor Black people, decent homes that the private market would not provide. The often racist stigma generated toward public housing does not and has not reflected people's lived realities. And as has been said, nobody likes public housing, except the people who live there and those who want to get in. And in many American cities, you will wait years and years on a wait list to get in because so many people need public housing and can't get it because the supply is so limited. And that's if the wait list is even open, which it's not in many cities. This week's episode is my interview with Edward Goetz on his book, New Deal Ruins: Race, Economic Justice, and Public Housing Policy. Goetz tells the story of the destruction and dismantling of public housing that took off in the 1980s and accelerated during the 90s under the Clinton administration's Hope 6 program. The stigmatization and demonization of public housing, and then its demolition, about half of which took place under Hope 6, reduced the number of public housing units by 370,000 from the early 1990s to the late 2010s. The hope in Hope 6 stood for housing opportunities for people everywhere. In fact, it was a neoliberal project to end public housing as we know it and remake cities for capital and the well-to-do. All of this history matters. Right now, in the wake of the destruction of public housing that Goetz discusses, housing organizers are looking back to the social housing agenda that Radford memorialized in Modern Housing for America. Soon, I'll be doing an interview on what social housing might look like today, from here in Rhode Island, where I'm involved in organizing around that, to all over the United States. I don't know if you noticed, but I rewrite my pitch for you to support The Dig at patreon.com/The Dig. I rewrite it each and every week because I know how easy it is to fast forward past people asking you for money. I do it all the time myself. But the reason I ask you for money, and there is a reason, is because this podcast would just straight up not exist without listener support. And the weird, amazing thing we do at The Dig is that support comes voluntarily, so we don't have to paywall a damn thing to squeeze donations out of people, which means that everyone is able to listen regardless of your ability to pay. And that is really important to us. That said, we will also send you a book or books or a tote bag or a mug in the mail if you contribute at least $10 a month or more. Please contribute now. Contribute what feels right. Do it. That's patreon.com/The Dig. Also, contributions get you our weekly newsletter delivered to your email inbox. It's a really good newsletter. You can also check them out for free at thedigradio.com, alongside the entirety of our vast archives. Okay, here's Edward Goetz, professor of urban planning and director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. He is the author of The One-Way Street of Integration, Fair Housing and the Pursuit of Racial Justice in American Cities, Clearing the Way, Deconcentrating the Poor in Urban America, and the book we're discussing today, New Deal Ruins, Race, Economic Justice, and Public Housing Policy. Edward Goetz, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you very much.
Let's start this interview about public housing at the beginning with the New Deal era defeat of proposals for a more expansive social housing system. Instead, the United States got this two-tier housing system that provided massive but politically less visible subsidies to white, middle, and working class people to become homeowners, coupled with public housing for the very poorest, people who were disproportionately black. I discussed this with Gail Radford at great length, but to frame our discussion, how was public housing as we came to know it shaped by the moment of its creation in the 1930s?
Sure. I think it's important to note that almost all housing policy that we pursue and have pursued historically in the United States has generally been pursued for a lot of other reasons other than their housing outcomes. And this is true of those largely invisible subsidies to the middle class that you were mentioning earlier. Those were pursued as a means of resurrecting the housing market and getting people back to work. And public housing, in a similar respect, was seen as a way of jumpstarting the economy in the middle of the Depression in the 1930s. It was felt that construction jobs that would ensue from a robust public housing effort would be helpful in turning around the economy, getting people back into employment, and then all of the follow-on kinds of economic impacts would trickle throughout the economy and be part of the Great Recovery. So that actually played an important role. The fact that public housing was oriented towards the lowest income members of society wasn't actually intended at the beginning. Public housing was meant to be a way station for people who were temporarily poor because of the effects of the Great Depression. So from the beginnings, many of the tenant screening criteria that were applied by public housing authorities across the country, in fact, disqualified the lowest income members of the population and instead focused on families that were working poor or temporarily disrupted by the Great Depression. And so this was an important fact in understanding how public housing came to look.
Public housing became majority black in many places, in part because it was means tested and so limited to the poorest of the poor. And poor people are disproportionately black, but it was also, of course, because black people were shut out of that federally subsidized private home ownership system, all at a time when black people amid the Great Migration were leaving the Jim Crow South and arriving in segregated metropolitan areas where they struggled to find housing in small and overcrowded Black ghettos, all at the same time, of course, that they were facing discrimination amid the onset of urban deindustrialization, meaning that there were growing numbers structurally excluded from the labor market. But how did that shift in public housing take place from that initial idea of serving the temporarily poor during the Great Depression to serving disproportionately Black people structurally excluded both from the labor market and from the homeownership market? How did that shift occur?
When the program began in the 1930s and well into the 1940s, it was not identified with Black people per se. It had no racial identification one way or the other. It was only in the 1950s and then into the 1960s when you saw a significant shift in the demographics of public housing. And that happened for a couple of reasons. The first was that the economic expansion in the post-war era started to open up different housing opportunities for working class and lower income households. And that kind of opening up of the economy those opportunities were not available to Black people. So what you saw was a greater opportunity structure for working class whites in the post-war era. And they began to move in large numbers out of central cities, out of public housing into a rejuvenated housing market that included more rental housing, but also included more subsidized forms of home ownership, also extended really primarily to a white population. And as whites moved out of public housing, remember, was still fairly new then and still in fairly good shape. And it represented the best housing option for many Blacks living in central cities all around the country. And so as more vacancies occurred, more Black families applied for and moved into public housing. And that transition occurred during the 1950s and then the 1960s. I think the other thing to note is that poverty began to change in important ways in the 1960s. It feminized a bit. It became more intergenerational than it had been in the past. And both of those kinds of phenomenon hit Black population much more so than it did the white population. And so at the same time that public housing was becoming racially identified with African Americans, the incomes and the earning potential of public housing population really declined relative to the prosperity that the rest of the economy was experiencing.
Federal law required, I think from the get-go, that public housing authorities, PHAs, enter into cooperation agreements with local government before constructing a housing project. And you write, quote, "This feature of the program created one of the ironies of public housing, that it was more effectively fought by its opponents after its passage than before." How did devolving the conflict over public housing to the local level shape what public housing became, and specifically its place within these metropolitan housing systems?
The ultimate decision about accepting public housing and locating it was left to local governments. And so local governments had to actually opt into the program and take conscious steps to create a housing authority that would receive the federal subsidies that helped build public housing. And this led to a lot of politicking at the local level and led to an important amount of influence over the way this nominally federal program was operated at the local level. So again, as I said, communities could opt in or opt out, and most of the communities that opt in were those that were suffering significant housing problems and shortages, and those were central cities. But suburban areas did not have to join the program, and they often resisted doing so. This is the kind of first factor that led to a concentration of these units in central city areas as opposed to suburban areas. But the other thing is that a lot of these local agreements, they included the power of approval on individual projects. So not just approval over whether the city as a whole would create a PHA and participate, but once there was a PHA and once it was operating and attempting to build public housing, oftentimes local governments, city councils then would exercise authority over where those units were built, and so would end up placing those units in neighborhoods that were typically located in redevelopment areas, in neighborhoods that had declined over previous decades, and in neighborhoods that were disproportionately occupied by people of color. And so that's what led then to the kind of segregation of public housing even within cities.
By the late 1930s, as I discussed with Gail Radford, the real estate industry was strong enough to defeat proposals for social housing and create this more limited system of public housing that came to exist in the United States. And that system was one that limited public housing to poor people that the private real estate industry was not going to serve, which meant that the private sector didn't have to worry about government competition. But you write that in the 1940s, the opposition to public housing grew even stronger. And as a result, it was close to getting killed off entirely in the mid-20th century. And it only survived by becoming attached to a larger program of urban renewal. But before we get to urban renewal, which I do want to talk about, what accounts for this intensified opposition to public housing at that moment, given that public housing was already limited to serving only those people who private industry didn't find it profitable to serve? Why the opposition if the forces of opposition already seemingly had gotten everything they wanted?
That's actually a very good question. I think in part it has to do with the difference in the political environment between 1937, when the program was initially created, and then 1949, when it had to be reauthorized. In 1937, we're still in the middle of a depression. We are in a situation of crisis economically, and it's a pre-war period where anti-communism wasn't as virulent a political strain as it became in the years after World War II. 1949 is a completely different kind of political economy and political environment. And this is the year that the public housing program has to be reauthorized by Congress. You have and so it's a combination then of a rejuvenated and more vigorous opposition from the real estate industry, as you described, which is still concerned about its role and its prerogatives in the housing market, and they're simply better organized at this point. They've seen 10 to 12 years of public housing. It becomes equated with socialist housing. And so there's this ideological kind of attack against public housing. It becomes something much bigger. It's about big government. It's about larger ideological questions in 1949 than it had been in 1937. And that's, I think, what accounts for significant strengthening of the opposition to it.
You see some of the this ideological opposition already present in the mid-1930s. I came across this quote from the president of the Atlanta Real Estate Board, who said, quote, "The working classes of this country will rue the day when they are housed in government-owned, government-built, and government-regulated houses. Masters house their slaves, but free men house themselves. Those who are descendants of pioneer American stock will not regard as home a unit in a fine building built at taxpayers' expense in a slum clearance project."
Yeah, powerful words.
Yeah, it really touches on everything there.
It does.
What was urban renewal? This broader project that public housing got attached to in 1949, and how did its overriding agenda of slum clearance shape what public housing became? And then how did that mid-20th century urban renewal movement compare to the slum clearance that had also accompanied the initial wave of public housing construction?
Sure. So 1949 is when the Urban Renewal Act was passed by Congress, and at this point, as I mentioned before, we're coming out of World War II. The economy is expanding rapidly, but American cities have been going through a couple of decades of disinvestment and decline, which actually accelerates in the post-war era as new housing opportunities are made available in suburban locations. And a few years later, the Interstate Highway Act makes it more possible for people to drive in and out of cities quite quickly and make suburban living even more feasible. So the urban renewal program was an effort to prime the pump for the private sector to come back into cities and to reinvest. The idea behind urban renewal is that there was a significant obstacle to reinvestment in the cities, and that was the existing physical stock. We had cities were characterized by older, obsolete buildings that had to be cleared, and there was a certain expense associated with that clearance. And the idea was that the public housing, or rather the urban renewal program, would subsidize that clearance and provide the private sector with a kind of clean slate on the landscape. And then reinvestment would occur, and we would see economic activity reemerging in central cities across the U.S. And so that was the model behind it. And that was why the program was so focused on clearance, large-scale demolition, the creation of pretty large parcels of land that would be available for almost a complete redefinition in purpose and in style in the 1950s and the 1960s. So that was the idea behind it. And public housing was tied to it because for many people, part of the opposition to public housing was to make sure it would be limited in new areas of growth and investment. And so it was seen as an appropriate use, perhaps for these older, revitalizing areas of central cities, but not so appropriate in kind of what's called greenfield development or development of previously undeveloped on the periphery of cities or in suburban areas.
And then what was the actual reality of urban renewal, and how did public housing fit into that as huge swaths of cities were remade in an attempt to, I guess, make them better competitors to the suburbs?
Yeah, the reality was that urban renewal resulted in the demolition of hundreds of thousands of units of low-cost housing that were deemed obsolete and not worthy of keeping around. It resulted in massive displacement of people of color in central cities across the United States. In fact, it was so associated with the displacement of blacks that James Baldwin memorably called it the Negro Removal Program. And so you saw it being deployed in neighborhoods that were primarily inhabited by very low-income people, but people of color as well. It ended up demolishing more housing than it built, and it ended up really generating a significant amount of political resistance after about 10 or 15 years from residents of these neighborhoods who saw the track record of urban renewal in other cities and realized that this was endangering their living in the central cities and their ability to remain in communities that they valued. So that was the impact. And public housing, a lot of public housing units were constructed in urban renewal sites. This was seen as perhaps the most politically expedient way to get public housing accepted in a lot of neighborhoods, because there were no existing neighbors left to oppose the public housing that was being built.
And did the public housing also become, in many cases, housing of last resort for those Black people who had been displaced?
Right. And so that this was happening exactly at that time when the racial profile of public housing was changing, and in many cities becoming more associated with African Americans, and who, it should be remembered, were continuing to face discrimination in the private housing market. And in fact, we're experiencing even heightened discrimination in the housing market, and just did not have the range of choices that even low-income whites had access to in the housing market.
Yeah, I mean, there was both legally enforced forms of exclusion and related popular forms of violent white resistance to Black people moving into their neighborhoods.
Yeah, the challenges faced by people of color in the housing market of American cities in the mid-20th century included politically determined kinds of public policies that allowed for the use of racially restrictive deeds, and even, in fact, encouraged the use of racially restrictive deeds. And then there were economic forms of discrimination that were practiced by private real estate operators and banks. And then there was a kind of popular community-based form of discrimination that was practiced really at the block level by primarily white residents who took it upon themselves to reinforce and maintain the racial boundaries in American cities by oftentimes engaging in violent and intimidating actions to keep Black families out of neighborhoods.
Let's turn to the organized neglect of public housing in the decades leading up to its active destruction. But a key piece of context here is that the vast majority of public housing units were never distressed. You write, quote, "This reality, applying as it does to so much public housing, is at odds with perceptions of the program fueled by popular press accounts of the worst public housing in our largest cities. Indeed, even in those cities, and in those specific projects that have manifestly failed to provide decent and safe housing for its inhabitants, there are contradictory experiences and more complexity than suggested by the disaster narrative." How then did this narrative get constructed? How did public housing come to stand in for a racialized urban crisis more generally? And then what realities did that narrative obscure?
Black communities in American cities have been stigmatized really over the decades. And as public housing became identified with Black residents, and as it became located and sited in the middle of Black communities, then it began to share that stigma. And this was reinforced through popular media accounts of various social pathologies that were thought to be existing at heightened levels inside of public housing complexes. This went hand in hand with concerns about the quote, the disintegration of the family within the African American community. The whole business of explaining Black poverty in the United States as being the result of individual failings of the community, really anything that wasn't associated with describing the actions and the processes of a system of white supremacy. Anything that sort of diverted our attention away from such a system and focused it on the individual failings of Blacks and their communities is what was taking place during these years. And so this led then to a kind of popular impression of public housing communities across the country as being lawless, as being places of immorality, as being places that are more or less hopeless from a standpoint of ever becoming a kind of functioning community. And although this actually approached truth in some of the worst cases of public housing, what was problematic was the misdiagnosis of the problem on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the application of that diagnosis to all public housing. The idea that the program as a whole was a failure because of the most publicized failures within certain American cities. And what I tried to do when I wrote the book is to acknowledge that there were significant problems with public housing in some cities that were where it was poorly managed, where it was underfunded, where there was a whole range of problems associated with disinvestment, both in the private sector and in the public sector in those communities. And that's a reality. What's not a reality is the diagnosis that this was an inherent part of the public housing program, or that it in fact characterized even a majority of public housing units. And I think that's the important thing we need to think about, that in most places, at most times, most public housing actually worked and served the functions that it was designed to serve.
That point on underfunding is key. Federal funding for a long time was limited to capital construction costs, meaning that PHAs had to pay for maintenance and upkeep through tenant rents, which, given who public housing is serving, is obviously a big problem. And in this effort to protect the private real estate industry from the get-go of public housing's creation and keep them from having to face the sort of government competition they would from a truly expansive social housing program, there were really sharp limits on how much money could be spent on public housing construction per unit.
Right. These cost containment factors, which really took precedence in the 1950s, really shaped the reality of public housing and led to site designs that emphasized high rises over low rise development, that emphasized cutting corners in terms of construction techniques and in terms of materials used. And so one of the outcomes of that obsession with cost containment at the front end is that a lot of public housing that was built in the 50s and the 60s was pretty poorly designed and poorly constructed, and therefore began to age pretty quickly. And this is really different and distinct from the very first kind of generation of public housing built in the 1930s and into the 40s, which was generally quite well designed, quite well constructed, and was built to last, and in fact did last for 60, 70, 80 years.
And that was even with cost controls intended politically by the opponents of public housing to make housing unattractive and unappealing. Even still, the early public housing was built to last in a way that was not true of projects constructed in the 50s and 60s.
That's exactly right. And the other side of the cost containment, that is the incomes that are eligible for public housing, that too was, of course, a constant element of the public housing program, and was, as you described, an effort to make sure that public housing would not ever compete with anything in the private rental market.
Yeah, I mean, as people's economic fortunes improve, let's say they get a better job, or they're in a job that wins a union and thus better wages, if their income goes over the limit, they are evicted from public housing.
Yes, that's correct. They lose their eligibility and are forced to move out. And so you have this rather contrary and ironic outcome of people who are upwardly mobile being forced to move out of public housing to make room for others. Yeah.
The 1972 demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe projects in St. Louis, which is well before the onset of mass demolition, that was really key to cementing this pathologized view of public housing in the American imagination. how did Pruitt-Igoe become such a politically consequential spectacle? And in what reality, again, did that spectacle obscure?
The Pruitt-Igoe was paradigmatic in so many different ways. It exhibited all of the kinds of negative construction characteristics that were emphasized and incentivized by the cost containment policies of public housing. So it was entirely high-rise development. It wasn't particularly well made in the sense that there were operational issues almost from the beginning in Pruitt-Igoe. The value put on reducing land costs led to a super concentration of units in a single neighborhood of St. Louis. And all of this was at odds with what was happening in the neighborhood surrounding it. The Pruitt-Igoe Towers looked nothing like the neighborhood that it was located in. If you look at some of the photographs, the aerial photographs of Pruitt-Igoe before it was torn down, it looks as if aliens could have just essentially placed this right in the middle of an American city for how different it was in its physical aspect and physical characteristics to the rest of the city.
I just pulled it up. That is what it looks like from the air.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's remarkable, both in its scale and in the way that it looks and compares to the rest of the city. And then I guess what's also important, though, is that the community in which it was placed was in the process of significant economic decline. And so all of these characteristics led to the decline of Pruitt-Igoe itself as the building started to show problems having to do with water leakage, various other construction issues. The neighborhood itself had no economic opportunities for the residents. It became, and the neighborhood surrounding it became identified with significant economic decline and social problems. And all of these things led to an accelerated decline and frankly, pretty alarming vacancy rates fairly early on. And it was decided then, after only a few years of operation, that Pruitt-Igoe was best dealt with by large-scale demolition. And
that demolition was indeed a national spectacle.
It was indeed, and became kind of the paradigmatic example for cities across the country. That the concern was that the housing in your city would end up being as dysfunctional as Pruitt-Igoe was, and necessitating a response as dramatic as total demolition. Even though during these years, the official position of HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, was that we should protect and retain as much public housing as possible. So that gives you a sense of the level of dysfunction that actually existed in Pruitt-Igoe and the problematic nature of the construction that had taken place.
Yet that begins to change not that long after, in the 1980s, in a more kind of unofficial shift of policy, and at a time when we see conditions in many big city projects deteriorating and more PHAs asking HUD for permission to demolish units, and HUD in turn granting many of those requests. And you write that a big part of this was a project of what was called de facto demolition, whereby PHAs would allow vacancy rates to rise while disinvesting in repair, accelerating the entire deterioration of a project, which would then prompt the PHA to ask HUD for permission to get rid of it. It was, you write, a mostly, quote, unknown and unannounced policy shift. So already by the end of the 1980s, the thousands of units of public housing that were still being built every year were roughly matched by the number that were getting demolished. Why did this unofficial project of de facto demolition take off when it did, and how did it operate?
Yeah, this is an important moment in the history of public housing. Through the 1970s, even with the problems that were associated with many public housing developments around the country, there was still an effort to expand the public housing stock. And it proceeded in fits and starts and never actually met projected needs. But nevertheless, the program was expanding. And there was a presumption on the part of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development that as much public housing as possible should be protected and should continue operating. At the same time, the negative perceptions of public housing were expanding to the point that many local housing authorities wanted to take the most advanced step in terms of what they felt was dealing with the problems of public housing and moved towards demolition. But Section 18 of the Housing Act that created public housing required local housing authorities to get the approval of HUD. They had to show HUD, they had to prove to HUD that the units that they wanted to demolish were in fact obsolete and that they had consulted with tenants about it and that this was the conclusion they had come to. And this was this could be a fairly high bar for many housing authorities to show and to demonstrate the obsolescence of these units because it wasn't really entirely obvious in all cases that they were obsolete. So the process of de facto demolition is one in which the housing authorities would simply allow the deterioration of their public housing stock. And they would do so by increasing vacancies. Sometimes they did this by simply not filling units that had become vacant. And then as those units remained unoccupied and fewer units on the site were occupied, then all sorts of neighborhood problems would start to creep in and you would see vandalism of units, and this would take more units off the property rolls, et cetera. And so it generated a kind of downward cycle of maintenance and repair. And of course, when you limit occupancy of the units, you are also voluntarily limiting your own income as a housing authority, right? So you had fewer resources with which to maintain those properties. In fact, maintaining those properties was not your objective. But the ultimate objective was to convince HUD that these units were in fact obsolete and needed to be demolished. And so this was a way of doing that, allowing the decline to reach a point where HUD had to agree that something as major as demolition had to occur. And that was the basis of de facto demolition.
Just imagine what that's like to suddenly have, over a year or two, half the apartments in your complex suddenly become empty. It's an extraordinarily different environment to live in. Why was that the objective of a growing number of PHAs? Why were they pursuing de facto demolition when they did?
They were doing so because they had identified these as their most problematic properties, the ones requiring the most improvement. And Congress had never provided as many resources as was necessary for the upkeep and the improvement of projects that were, beginning to age out. They were beginning to be 30, 40 years old. And as I said earlier, sort of as a result of suboptimal kinds of construction techniques and materials, they were aging more rapidly. And so a lot of housing authorities looked at demolition as their best option in an environment where it was very difficult for them to raise the funds necessary to turn around problematic properties. And they may have also come to the conclusion that they could never operate a well-functioning public housing development at that location, and so would pursue demolition. This begins to turn around in the 1990s or in the 1980s, right? As more of these housing authorities realize that demolition is a real option. I can't overstate how unusual Pruitt-Igoe had been in 1972. As important as it is, as an example, it was still a significant exception to how public housing was dealt with. And so it did take this kind of informal, small-scale turnaround in the 1980s to generate the idea that, well, maybe demolition is the best course of action.
PHAs, as you say, did face major economic issues in the 1980s, but were they also perhaps coming around to the conclusion that they didn't want so many people like public housing residents in their cities? Did that play a role?
Public housing authorities, that's their mission,
right,
is to serve this population. And the commitment to that mission, I guess, varies from place to place, as does the quality of public housing administration and management, right? And so in some cities, public housing authorities are a little bit more independent and a little bit more capable than they are in other cities. And I would agree that in the 1980s, you see a lot of local officials coming to the conclusion that these large communities of public housing are not assets for their city. And you see a growing acceptance of the idea of getting rid of them altogether.
Let's turn to the core of your book, Hope 6, which was the centerpiece of Bill Clinton's public housing program, and also, in many ways, the end of public housing as we knew it. How did Hope 6 come about, and how did demolition become its focus in what you write was a remarkably sudden shift in official policy? Because it had only been a few years prior that the National Commission on Severely Distressed Public Housing, created by Congress in 1989, had found that just 6% of the nationwide public housing stock was severely distressed. And you write that the commission, quote, clearly envisioned a program of rehabilitation and renovation, one that did not diminish the size of the public housing stock nationwide. What happened? How did the program of de facto demolition of the 1980s that we were discussing become this enthusiastic and explicit program of demolition in the 1990s?
That happened in a number of different ways. The first has to do with what the political and economic environment was like in the early 1990s. American cities are still sort of reeling from a crack cocaine epidemic, which I think really generated something akin to a moral panic in a lot of American cities about escalation of crime, about the dysfunctionality of neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. Really an idea that American cities, as we knew them, were kind of being lost. And there was this other America that was being generated in these neighborhoods of high crime, high poverty, drug use, drug abuse, et cetera. And so this moral panic kind of dominated the day, right? Every new iteration of Congress tried to outdo the previous session in terms of being tough on crime. And you saw the Clinton administration's concern about reinventing welfare, about ending as we know it, et cetera. And so this was a period of time when the prevailing notions of American cities were notions that of a deeply problematic nature, that our cities were facing challenges that were simply quantitatively different than had ever been faced before. And this developed at the same time that the National Commission was writing its report. And although the commission, which included housing officials, it included public housing residents, the commission comes out with a pretty moderate piece of analysis and a set of recommendations for a kind of rehab-based program of modernization, one that would also include a lot of social supports for residents. The commission explicitly says that the solution to public housing should not focus on the physical conditions and the physical remaking of public housing, but that this is what, in fact, exactly happens. And the commission issues its report in 1992, and within months, Congress has created a demonstration program called the Urban Redevelopment Demonstration Program. This is what becomes Hope 6 in another year or so. And it's a program that is primarily aimed at rehabilitation of the most severely distressed public housing. So it hews pretty closely to the recommendations of the commission. But keeping in mind that background of moral panic, and then you have a new Secretary of HUD, the former mayor of the city of San Antonio, Henry Cisneros, who begins a tour of public housing across the country. And I guess, as most HUD directors do, he wasn't taking a tour of the well-functioning public housing. He was, in fact, taking a tour of the worst of public housing. And he begins to become convinced that the kind of moderate approach called for by the commission, and in fact embodied in that first piece of legislation, he begins to think that maybe that's inadequate to the task, that the problems that he witnessed in cities like Baltimore and Chicago are just too great to be dealt with by a moderate form of rehabilitation. Then you have the midterm elections of 1994 and the rise of Newt Gingrich and the Republican Party's Contract for America, which includes significant changes for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, right? The designs that the Republican majority in Congress had on HUD were that it might even be eliminated, right? And so Cisneros sees himself at the head of an agency that is now endangered, and so he puts his staff through this exercise and creates what is called the HUD Reinvention Blueprint, which also comes out in 1994 as a result of these midterm elections. And the Reinvention Blueprint is a fairly radical vision for HUD moving forward, and it includes a radical kind of redefinition of public housing, taking it away from the form that it had taken in the first 40 years of its life, and thinking about the privatization of public housing, about the switch of public housing subsidies into tenant-based forms of housing subsidies that
vouchers, exactly, that families can take with them and use throughout the housing market, et cetera. And so there's this notion that the big steps are needed, big changes are needed in the way HUD does business, and public housing being chief among the problems facing HUD, then all of these start to be applied to public housing. In 1995, HUD begins to emphasize the leveraging of private investment in all of the proposals that it's getting for Hope 6 projects across the country. And this is a direct signal and a clear signal to local housing authorities that HUD wants to see significant neighborhood change taking place in any kind of Hope 6 site. And so you had that happening. I guess the other things that that are important here is that the 1990s were the first decade where we started to see some central cities
actually rebounding in terms of population and economic activity. So there was this kind of nascent market for private sector investment in a lot of central cities, and most of it in the form of kind of expanding downtowns and taking advantage of the amenities that exist in downtown areas in most American cities. And what stood in the way in a lot of cities were older public housing developments. And they began to be seen as an obstacle to central city revitalization at this time. So all of these factors sort of converge around 1994, 95, and they contribute to a fairly quick change in the approach of the Hope 6 program from being kind of a moderate or rehab approach to being one that emphasizes full-scale demolition, significant leveraging of private sector investment, the replacement of monolithic public housing developments with mixed income developments that will attract market rate families and market rate households. It's an entirely new paradigm. And it was wholeheartedly adopted by Cisneros and HUD at that time.
And really critical to facilitating this all is the elimination of a rule that every public housing unit destroyed has to be replaced by a newly built unit, because that's what allows Hope 6 to achieve a net reduction in the number of public housing units. Otherwise, according to that rule, even if they redeveloped everything, they would have to end up with the same number of units, which is not what happened.
That's exactly right. And that one-for-one replacement rule, which had been in place for a couple of decades, was seen as a major obstacle to the kind of redevelopment that most officials wanted to see. And they didn't want to replace public housing one-for-one. They wanted a smaller a profile for public housing. They wanted to integrate it with market rate units and other forms of less subsidized housing. And that was all problematic if that one-for-one replacement rule was in place. And so, yes, the elimination of that became a very important step in the transition of Hope 6 into a demolition first program.
You write, quote, "The evolution of Hope 6 in the direction of demolition was the result of the emergence of the mixed income model and the belief among HUD officials that the design of older public housing was one of the core reasons for its decline." There are two key things there I want to unpack, I think. One is about the concentration of poverty and its deconcentration, and then another is about architecture and design. And let's start with the concentration and deconcentration of poverty. So federal, state, and local governments had, of course, for decades helped ensure that Black people were segregated into poor and overwhelmingly Black neighborhoods. And, of course, the private sector did so as well, hand in hand with the government. How, by the 1990s, had deconcentrating that poverty emerged as a priority for public housing officials and for politicians more generally? What sort of assumptions about poor people and poor Black people in particular did that poverty deconcentration agenda entail? And then what was the envisioned solution? Because notably, there wasn't much poverty deconcentration. Most displaced people moved to other poor and Black neighborhoods.
Yeah. So again, I think it's important for us to think about the context of that period. Coming out of the 1980s with the crack cocaine epidemic and the moral panic associated with rising crime, you also saw social scientists begin to study urban poverty in ways that they hadn't before. And there was the publication of a very influential book by the sociologist William Julius Wilson, who at that time was at the University of Chicago and studying Chicago. And he argued that
the truly disadvantaged.
Right, yes. And in that book, he highlights the problem of concentrated poverty, not just poverty, the extent of poverty, but the fact that it is spatially concentrated and that it reaches such an extensive proportion of the population. And his diagnosis of concentrations of poverty was quickly followed up by other social scientists who began to delve more deeply into that concept. And you had some working sort of on quantitative empirical studies. You had others doing qualitative work, interview-based work with people living in those communities. And the emerging understanding of American urban poverty at that time was that in those communities where more than about 40% of the population was below the poverty level, that the social problems that resulted were significantly different. It was a nonlinear increase in the amount of social pathologies in those types of neighborhoods. So there was something about that threshold. There was something about a concentration effect at that level. And so deconcentration, of course, became the kind of byword for officials and for social scientists. The other thing that's important about this is that this diagnosis of intergenerational poverty is one that doesn't directly blame the victim, right? This isn't about the individual pathologies of poor people. It's not identifying the problem in their behavior or their morals or lack thereof. It's not identifying the problem in terms of social dysfunction. These were all theories of poverty that had dominated American policymaking for the previous 10, 15 years. And they were propagated by conservative social scientists who were identifying the defects of poor people themselves as the problem of poverty. And so this notion of spatial concentration was immediately attractive to more progressive social scientists and liberal policymakers, because it was a response to the kind of blaming the victim version of poverty that had been propagated by more conservative analysts. And you saw a lot of liberal social scientists and policy analysts taking up this notion of concentration of poverty, and because it appealed to their views of poverty, and so the policy response then, if the problem is a concentration of poverty, the obvious policy response would be the deconcentration of that poverty. And public housing complexes in central cities were kind of ground zero for this type of concentration of poverty. Public housing complexes were seen as concentrating poverty both directly and indirectly. It would directly concentrate poverty because you had to be poor to be in public housing, right? That was the rule. But it indirectly concentrated poverty because the conditions in those complexes were so bad that anyone living around them in the private market who had any choices at all in the housing market would flee those neighborhoods and move elsewhere, leaving only those with the fewest resources. So public housing was seen as having this direct and indirect impact on concentrating poverty. And so this social science kind of policy idea merged perfectly with the kind of Hope 6 approach and led to then this idea that we could significantly deconcentrate poverty if we just tore these units down, gave people the means to move elsewhere, and then rebuilt, but rebuilt at a lower density and with fewer public housing units that were interspersed with market rate units and other units, so that we can achieve this kind of critical deconcentration.
And conveniently for New Democrats, this wasn't blaming the increasingly neoliberalized American capitalism, the problem could be solved by moving people around.
That's right.
And as you write, quote, one of the most intrusive forms of state power that can be directed against citizens, that is, their forced relocation followed by the demolition of their homes, is presented as the opposite.
Right. It's the solution to their problems. It was presented to them as a means of providing them with choice in the housing market, which always struck me as it's the kind of choice that a mugger gives you when approaching you with his gun. Right. You have a choice to reinvest your money in a slightly different way.
Yeah, and there's something about the whole theory here that seems premised on really missing the role, or really oversimplifying the role played by segregation in mid-century American capitalism. So that if you just sort of say, okay, you can live wherever you want now, that, I don't know, maybe it seems like it's premised on the very same notions that these kind of liberal notions that exclusion from the mid-century bounty were the core of the problem, rather than kind of understanding the constitutive role played by those kind of exclusions and subordinations.
Right. That's a great way of putting it, because it pictures poverty as an exception to an otherwise sort of functioning system, right? And that if we can simply get people to better and more supportive environments that came to be known as opportunity neighborhoods, places where they would have better opportunities for education, for jobs, et cetera, that if we could just get people to those communities, then we could have a fighting chance against this intergenerational poverty. It's look, from the hindsight of 40 years, it's easier to dismiss now than it was then, in the sense that there was a significant amount of social science research showing those concentration effects, right? That after you get above that threshold of poverty, these social pathologies accelerated significantly. There was also, and there still is, social science evidence to the effect that students of color do better in more integrated schools, and we know that crime rates are less problematic in wider communities. We know that housing values appreciate more in wider communities. And I think it's true. That it turns out to be a rather simplistic view of the world that suggests that all the forms of discrimination that produce segregation in the first place would somehow disappear if we could just rearrange people in space. But that was the prevailing notion, and the prevailing concerns about those quote unquote dysfunctional concentrations of poverty were so great that there was widespread agreement that just eliminating them without doing anything else would serve people and would serve communities well.
Yeah, I mean, as if the so-called kind of mainstream system that they're trying to include poor people into and thus kind of somehow render them non-poor isn't what's creating the poverty in the first place, which is why I imagine you can find social scientific evidence for some of this working in kind of small cohort cases on the margin, but it can't fundamentally work on a systemic or structural level because that would require actually changing the system, not including the people whose subordination the system requires.
Right. Yeah. And, I think that when I write about New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, it's just a great example of it. Here's a major disaster that befalls not only the city of New Orleans, but most concentratedly those low-income communities, right? And then you have pundits. You have David Brooks saying, well, there's a silver lining here. And the silver lining is we get to rearrange poor people now, that they don't have to go back to those old communities and back to that old way of living. And when it came to public housing, they weren't allowed to go back, right? Those communities were fenced off after Katrina, and those populations were simply not allowed to ever re-inhabit those units. It's remarkable.
Yeah, after Katrina hit in August 2005, the city just closed down 6 large projects. Residents were not only barred from reoccupying their units, they couldn't even retrieve their belongings in most cases, and the projects did not sustain serious damage. It was purely seizing an opportunity to.
Yeah, that's the unforgivable part to me, is that this was just utterly pretense, right? Because some of those buildings had survived really quite well and were still quite functional. This was taking that disaster and leveraging it to achieve large-scale displacement of very low-income people of color.
And remarkably in New Orleans is that racism was the subtext in so many cities' Hope 6 experience, but it just became the text in New Orleans with this Republican congressman from Baton Rouge, Richard Baker, saying, quote, "We finally cleaned up public housing. We couldn't do it, but God did." Bush's HUD secretary, Alphonso Jackson, said New Orleans will not, quote, "be as black as it was for a long time, if ever again."
I don't know what to add to that. Yeah.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire, 1882 to 1917, by Eric Blanc. Through extensive archival research in 8 different languages, Revolutionary Social Democracy introduces readers to the politics and practices of socialists in Tsarist Russia's imperial borderlands. These parties fought for democracy and workers' power across the entire span of the Russian Empire, from the factories of Warsaw to the oil fields of Baku to the autonomous parliament of Finland. Eric Blanc's incisive study of these parties shows that the Russian Revolution was far less Russian than is commonly assumed. The implications of this discovery challenge long-held assumptions about the dynamics of revolutionary change under both autocratic and democratic conditions. Revolutionary Social Democracy by Eric Blanc, out now from Haymarket Books, and available on haymarketbooks.org, where US and UK readers receive free shipping on orders over $25 and £25, respectively. You note that creating mixed income communities or improving the lived environment of projects by no means hypothetically has to mean the destruction of public housing. Quote, "Though advocates of redevelopment position it as the solution to ongoing problems of public housing and as a means of creating stable and decent living environments for the poor, there have been no attempts to use this model to expand the public housing stock. In fact, the new model is employed almost exclusively to reduce the scope of the program and the number of subsidized, very low-income units. What if redevelopment and mixed-income projects don't have to be inherently used to reduce the stock of public housing? And, I don't think that they do, because, forms of redevelopment and mixed income would be precisely what is required to make actual social housing, Vienna-style social housing, let's say, a reality in the United States. What does it reveal that that's almost exclusively how it has been used, or exclusively how it's been used?
Right. I think what it reveals is that the rationales that are given and that were given for Hope 6, the idea that this was about the improvement of lives for the residents of public housing, I think what it reveals is that was always a ruse, that in fact the major objective of Hope 6 in public housing redevelopment was the physical remaking of large swaths of central cities in the United States, of clearing the way for private sector reinvestment, a new round of profit-taking in neighborhoods that were in the path of redevelopment, and in fact where the only obstacle to that redevelopment was the public housing complex that was on site. So, you get people adamantly defending Hope 6 by saying, look, this is just the new way of doing public housing. We have to do it in a mixed income type of way. It's better for residents. And we've just learned our lessons, right? We're not going to use those old modernist kinds of designs. We're going to use new urbanism. We're going to give everybody a porch. We're going to increase the human capital, the social capital in these communities. This is the way to build public housing. And that's what you heard. That's what you heard. But if that were really the way to build public housing, why didn't we build more public housing that way, right? So my point in the book was that we only use this model to effectuate a retrenchment in the program. This was a way of putting lipstick on that particular pig by convincing ourselves, perhaps, or others that we had discovered a new and better way of building public housing. And that may or may not be, but it strikes me as disingenuous when we only use it in the context of reducing the housing stock.
Right. And a lot of major public housing projects in big cities were conveniently standing in the way of gentrification of strategically located neighborhoods. Chicago's Cabrini Green, Houston's Allen Parkway Village, New Orleans's St. Thomas, Philly's Martin Luther King. All of these projects that are standing in the way of gentrification. And when those obstacles are removed, that gentrification can really tear through. So not only are deeply affordable public housing units eliminated, but the rents in the surrounding neighborhoods can go through the roof, further reducing affordability.
Right, and that's what you find when you look at the data. Right, is that in many of these cities, there are these kinds of nascent real estate markets ready to react when that public housing is demolished, and in fact, sometimes react even on the mere announcement of the pending demolition of a public housing project. So that was in fact the case in a lot of cities, and I found in my analysis that actually explains which cities were the most aggressive in demolishing public housing during the 1990s. This was about clearing the way for gentrification and private sector investment in neighborhoods generally near downtowns, but almost always in the path of redevelopment.
Chicago is a really exemplary case here. HUD actually took over the Chicago Housing Authority in 1995, and then in 2000, shortly after CHA regained its independence, it submitted its plan for transformation to HUD, which would lead to the massive destruction of public housing in the city. I lived in Chicago the summer of 2001, and I think saw Cabrini Green and whatnot in its very final years of existence. You write, quote, "The PFT in Chicago was not merely an effort to remake public housing. It became the city's major urban redevelopment initiative of the new decade and the largest public works program in the city's history." Where did the PFT fit into this broader plan to remake Chicago? Who was the city being transformed for, and why?
Well, the PFT is probably the best example of reclaiming urban territory for new investment, for the private sector, and for wealthier residents. Right? So Chicago had the second most public housing units of any city in the United States. Only New York City had more. And so, Chicago had this vast network of public housing projects all around downtown, northwest and south, right, of downtown. And the city felt constrained by this kind of necklace of public housing developments. And during the 1990s and the early 2000s, when investment was returning to central cities, Chicago wanted to make sure that that happened there as well. And you had Richard Daley Jr. or the second or whatever he is was the mayor at the time, and you had the MacArthur Foundation working very closely with Daley at this time to really reimagine Chicago without that public housing stock that almost all observers felt was an albatross around the city's neck. And so you saw the transformation at a scale in Chicago that was not matched anywhere else in the country, and you saw massive foundation investment and private sector investment and real ambition to remake the city of Chicago, and that's what made it the city's largest public works development public works project in its history. It was the most ambitious one of its sort in the country.
Revealingly, you note that Chicago agencies would cooperate citywide, dedicating huge amounts of attention, labor, resources in this effort to destroy public housing, the sort of things they could never seem to muster to just simply improve public housing and serve public housing residents.
Yeah, right. And these directives came from the top, right? This was Daley's major objective during this period of time, and so the coordination of different city agencies to accomplish this and to make this work was a great priority of his administration.
Let's turn to the politics of public housing architecture and design. What sort of buildings were built as public housing projects over the decades? How were prevailing designs shaped by everything from changing ideological norms to federally imposed cost constraints? And more specifically, how did modernism go from being so in fashion to being blamed for nurturing social pathology, with new urbanism presented as the solution? And then what sort of assumptions did each moment entail about the role played by the built environment in shaping the lives and even subjectivities of its inhabitants?
Yeah, there's a lot in that. And so, we have to begin again with how public housing was imagined in its early years. I think the first round of public housing construction, as I noted before, was generally pretty remarkable, and in its quality. It was, I think, what has come to be known as New Deal kinds of architecture and design, and not modernist per se, but that modernism began seeping into design considerations in public housing at the same time that cost containment became the overriding principle of design and construction. There was an idea that simple modernist kinds of developments that lacked any kind of architectural flourish or any kinds of individuality to units, that these developments reflected the kinds of working class ambitions of the housing itself, right? That this was housing for the working person and would therefore not be subject to the kinds of architectural flourishes and excesses that we have seen in previous design periods, right? And so there was that element. The other element was that public housing was being placed in urban renewal sites in parts of the city that had been experiencing significant decline. And so to set public housing apart from what was regarded as its negative influences that surrounded it, modernism was seen as a way of doing that, as a way of sort of making it visually distinct from the rest of the neighborhood surrounding it, in hopes that it would survive and repel the negative influences from those poor communities in which it was placed. And so you had, and then finally, I guess those, as I said, those cost containment elements of construction really lent themselves quite well to a modernist kind of architectural design that did not include any kind of individuality for units, any kind of flourish at all, right? These were box cutter kinds of designs, and that fit cost containment quite well. So for all these reasons, there was a lot of this stuff built in the late 40s, 50s, and the 60s, but they didn't age very well. And as I mentioned, part of that had to do with construction materials and techniques, but part of it had to do with design as well. The modernist kinds of buildings started to look pretty alien to the neighborhoods that they were located in. Modernism in general did not take off very well as an architectural model in American cities. And so the very fact that all public housing was modernist, or most of it was modernist, contributed to the fact that it did stand out visually and that it became stigmatized visually as well. I mean, you could, in most American cities in the 1960s, you could drive around and you could spot a public housing development, a high-rise from blocks away, and you just knew it was public housing because of the way it looked and the way it was distinctive for those modernist kinds of characteristics. Over time, then, the design became problematized by those who were trying to figure out what was wrong with these communities. And they felt that the lack of individual space that you saw in modernist developments, that in itself led to an under-maintenance by the residents. That if space didn't belong to any individual, then it belonged to no one, and no one took care of it. And it would be easily sort of co-opted by outside forces, gangs, and the like, who would take over common spaces, et cetera. The lack of what was called defensible space was also blamed as part of the modernist argument. And then finally, there was just a sense that these were visually alienating, that the very lack of ornamentation really seemed to visually reflect a lack of care and a lack of interest on the part of those who put it there and on the part of those who live there. And all of these things were thought to contribute to the negative outcomes that were associated with a lot of these developments. And then instead, you have the emergence of this new architectural and design theory called New Urbanism, which really kind of advocated the complete opposite of modernism, right? This was an idea that emphasized bringing people back to a human scale, bringing buildings, rather, back to a human scale, to bring the buildings closer to the sidewalk, closer to the edge of the lot and the parcel. It called for the elimination of these public spaces, these no man's lands that so dominated modernist public housing, and so you had and in fact the new urbanist design theory was adopted wholeheartedly by HUD, and Cisneros was a great believer in new urbanism and felt that these design approaches could be an important part of the solution to public housing problems.
To what extent was looking to architectural explanations and solutions missing the point, and in doing so, perhaps exactly why it was so appealing?
Well, it misses the point because there is any number of well-functioning, high-income, modernist apartment buildings in every city in the United States, right? So it couldn't have been the buildings themselves. It couldn't have been the design. What in fact was the problem was the disinvestment, was the underinvestment, was the poor management, and various other elements that policymakers just didn't want to face. And so to be able to tear down a modernist public housing high-rise and to replace it with a low-rise new urbanist community was seen as easier and seen as more concrete evidence of change and positive change than to busy oneself with questions of better management and better investment in the families and in the buildings themselves.
It's also hard for me to believe that new urbanism is inherently a handmaiden to neoliberalism. Why then was and is that so often the case? Why did it work so well at that time and arguably continues to do so to facilitate the privatization and destruction of public housing?
That's a really good question that I'm not sure I do have the answer for. The timing is important, that new urbanism emerges at the same time that that also emerges this compulsion to privatize public housing and to really remake it. And so in some respects, there's just the opportunity component of it, right? It was the new and handy architectural theory. The fact that it probably overstates the impact of design is becoming more, I think, apparent with the passage of years. But I think that it just contributed to this notion of a complete break with the past, not just the way we finance it and operate it, not just with who lives there, but in the very way that it looks and integrates with the rest of the community.
Yeah, I mean, walkable neighborhoods should be a good thing. It's just under a kind of neoliberal capitalist paradigm, public housing residents are not the ones walking in those neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah. It does leave all those other details unresolved. Yeah.
So, not to be too sympathetic to these city leaders, but are they, in some sense, just responding to an intensifying logic and set of interests that are encouraged and even imposed upon cities by the geographic and political organization of American capitalism, especially as it's reorganized by post-war suburbanization, the way that capital mobility alongside school and housing segregation in between municipalities with separate tax bases and separate school systems? Was this development model catering to the well-to-do, overdetermined by that historical context?
That's a long-standing question. I think political scientists, sociologists have considered that and agreed in various degrees for decades, right? That there is this kind of development mantra that local officials have to adopt, that there is a set of policies that they are simply forced into following because of the fiscal constraints that they are faced with and the model of mobile capitalism that operates. So I think that's true. I don't think that we can dismiss it out of hand, but I do think that there are examples of when this logic does not drive all types of local development policymaking, when this kind of logic does not drive policymaking even more generally in cities. So I think we can agree that there is importance to this overriding logic, but I don't think but to regard it as completely determinative, I think really underestimates the degree to which local communities do have agency in determining what cities can look like. I think lets local officials off the hook a little bit.
So, yeah, I mean, capital mobility means that there are serious challenges to creating social democracy in one city, but it doesn't make it impossible, and it doesn't foreclose or it doesn't impose a certain kind of bleakly neoliberal outcome on any given city.
That's correct. And I would think in this specific case of public housing redevelopment, it does not necessitate the type of solution that Hope 6 embodies.
One thing that we haven't touched on yet that's important to highlight is that there was a major carceral component to the neoliberalization of public housing policy. Clinton imposed these new tenant screening policies, work requirements, and a draconian crackdown on criminal convictions, a one strike and you're out rule that meant an entire family could be evicted if a single member was convicted of a crime. You touched on this a little bit at the top of the interview, but where did public housing politics fit into this broader politics of punishment that pervaded the Clinton agenda, from the war on crime and immigrants to welfare reform? And what did that carceral aspect reveal about the true ambitions of Hope 6?
Well, I think given the problematic stigmatization of public housing communities and the residents who lived in them, I think it's quite clear that public housing becomes a very natural place to play out these more carceral aspects of neoliberalism, right? If we're going to begin cracking down in the most extreme ways on the crime and the drug abuse that is supposedly rampant in American cities, the place to start would be ground zero for all of this, and that would be the major public housing complexes. I think that's really quite clear, that the negative, this discourse of disaster makes public housing the clear place to begin this kind of crackdown and to apply it most severely. So I think there's that to it. I think it's the one strike and you're out. It's also the creation of zones where federal policies apply in terms of punishment as opposed to local policies, right? So you can get arrested for the same offense in public housing as you would across the street, but because it's public housing, you are subject to much more stringent federal guidelines for sentencing, and so that's part of this dynamic as well. And what it reveals about the true intentions of Hope 6 is, I think, a great deal, and it reveals that it wasn't truly about the well-being of residents. I think that the response on the part of policymakers is that a lot of public housing residents were in favor of some of these more draconian anti-crime measures. And that, in fact, is in part true, right? But that's a testament to the poor conditions that existed in those communities, that some people were willing to forfeit some of their civil liberties for the idea that they might end up living in a safer environment, and that only speaks to the level of neglect that many of these communities had endured over time.
Yeah, meaningfully addressing or ameliorating the root causes of these problems is never really an option that's put on the table.
It's not on the table, right?
And there's also a real tension here between making public housing residents the primary victims who these policies are intended to save and making them out to be the principal threats and perpetrators. There's a tension. There seems to be like a tension there.
There is.
Unsurprisingly, there was tenant resistance to Hope 6, but you write, quote, "What is perhaps more remarkable than the demonstrations against housing demolition is the fact that they do not occur more frequently." Why did tenants so often acquiesce to or even support the destruction of their homes? Was it, just as we were sort of discussing just now about crime, that the options presented to them were the status quo versus the possibility, however remote, that they might return to improved and redeveloped projects?
Yeah, I think that this lack of resistance is important, and it's important to understand. And I think that I think the primary reason for it is that it was a manipulated outcome. So if we think back to de facto demolition, we see a process whereby units or projects are slowly depopulated over time. And when the decision is made to finally tear them down and to perhaps pursue a Hope 6 grant to do so, there are very few tenants around anymore. And those who are around have been enduring an environment where of massive vacancies, where the environment is not safe and they understand it to be unsafe. And so there just isn't the will or the critical mass of tenants to oppose a demolition. It just becomes a little bit more palatable at that point. I think the other element of it is that Hope 6 incorporated processes of participation on the part of tenants. So HUD required local housing authorities to involve the existing tenants when Hope 6 applications were made and when design plans were made. And so you saw housing authorities organizing tenants, getting them to design charrettes and talking to them, collecting their ideas. They would often ask residents, what would you like your community to look like? What kinds of changes would you like to see in your community? And what they were doing was they were purchasing buy-in from these communities, from these residents. They were facilitating the acquiescence of those residents by implying a couple of things. One, that they were going to have an important impact on the design outcomes that were finally decided upon. And second, that they would in fact inhabit these new communities after the demolition had occurred and after the redevelopment had occurred, right? So they were, and I think this is one of the more despicable elements of Hope 6, is that it played on the desire of communities, of public housing residents, to live in better communities and to live in new communities that were designed for them. And it therefore sort of bought their acquiescence in a process that in the end really had almost no additional impact on those tenants other than to displace them.
One of the most consequential features, I think, of the destruction of public housing are its political and ideological ramifications beyond the impact on the immediately displaced people, or the fact that we've experienced not only a net reduction in public housing units, but since the year 2000, a net reduction in per capita deeply and moderately affordable units, regardless of whether they're traditional public housing or not. But you write, quote, "Public housing, as it was conceived during the New Deal and as it has operated during the subsequent decades, is no longer seen as a viable policy option for meeting affordable housing needs." So whether we're talking in more conventional American terms about the Overton window or in Gramscian terms about hegemony, whatever, in the midst of today's housing crisis, both this acute crisis in the past couple years and also a longer running crisis over the past few decades as rentals have become increasingly unaffordable to tenants, what has it meant that the idea of more public housing has not been on the table, has not been even conceivable as a possible solution, at least until very, very recently?
Yeah, I mean, this is the ultimate victory of the neoliberal approach, is to eliminate public housing as an option, right? And that was only possible after an extended period of stigmatization and delegitimization of public housing, right? This was the creation of that discourse of disaster, which emerged over a period of 20 years or so, and was in part the result of the racialization of public housing. That was the first step, was to delegitimize public housing. And the second step then was to find a palatable way of demolishing it and eliminating it as an option. And that's where the ideas of new urbanism, of dispersing concentrations of poverty, that was the weight carried by those ideas, was to get us to a place where we no longer even consider public housing as a viable option for meeting the very real and very extensive housing needs that we have in this country that have only gotten worse since we started tearing down public housing as well. And so that's the real importance. I think there was it was accompanied by a campaign that really was a misdirection campaign of getting us to focus on problems that weren't problems, such as modernism, such as concentrations of poverty, when those problems that really affected public housing had to do with commitment and investment levels, et cetera. And you layer on top of that the kind of paternalistic approach that we took, which was to determine as outsiders what was quote unquote best for public housing residents, instead of meaningfully involving them in the process. And then you add what I think is a certain sort of self-congratulatory element of thinking that we have made the brave choice, that we have made created a strong response to the worst problems of urban poverty. We've looked the problem directly in the eye and made the difficult choice of tearing down those units to build a new and different urban environment. All of those conceits are really problematic to me, but reflect a pretty well-functioning sort of zeitgeist.
Well, Edward Goetz, thanks so very much.
Thank you for having me.
Edward Goetz is a professor of urban planning and director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and the author of New Deal Ruins: Race, Economic Justice, and Public Housing Policy. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that one part of society thus exacts tribute from another for the permission to inhabit the earth, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis and recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Tamuz Frankel and Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Rio-Francos and Ben Mabee. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes, please also rate and review us. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you telling your friends to check out the pod. Either real-life friends or internet friends. Either are great. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.